Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and this is a test video. Ever since the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, YouTube has adjusted its algorithm. As such, I think that I might be freer to talk like a normal person and not need to affect the anger and make the odd word choices made I to the past. And do keep in mind, I was largely putting on an affectation when I was doing that. I didn't really like doing it, because it's actually physically strenuous to do that, even if you don't feel the actual anger. But I did so, and chose my words so that I was imitating the speech patterns that you would hear from militant atheist channels when they speak of Christianity. And the reason I did that was because the artificial intelligence that the Tube of You runs on, which I was calling Al Gore and his rhythm, or just Al Gore for short, really doesn't understand what it is you're saying. It only really understood the tone of voice as well as word patterns. If you didn't speak with a normal word pattern that was part of its language model, it really didn't have a way of developing a new understanding of your speech patterns, and instead simply tried to fit it within the closest proximate parameters. So I would choose certain words that the artificial intelligence and algorithm had decided would likely put me in the atheist and left-wing category, though it was rather tedious to do so, because I was affecting the anger as well as making odd word choices. I also exaggerated the pauses that I give, which are because of a health issue, believe it or not, which I'm still not over with yet. I'm still waiting for my surgery. But when you think about it, the way the AI worked on YouTube, it didn't really think like a human. In addition to not really processing the information the same way a human would, listening to what is said and trying to understand it, the AI worked on language models and attempted to match patterns, and it did so in a very mechanical way. And it was programmed by people who are left-wing politically, and they're generally more sympathetic to atheists than they are to Christians. But for the most part, they were less concerned with the atheist versus Christian debate as they were with politics. And the atheist movement is largely associated with left-wing politics. And I know there are conservative atheists and right-wing atheists, yada yada yada. There are also left-wing Christians. But the general cultural narrative is Christians are right-wing, and in America, where Google is based for the most part, they vote Republican, whilst atheists are left-wing and vote Democrat. That was the operative assumption being made by the AI. However, the artificial intelligence also determined things based upon popularity of the channel, how many views on average you would get, and how many subscribers you had, which is something that would have to be considered even if a human were determining what to do on the channel and who to promote. And for the same reason, if, for example, a popular conservative channel were simply deleted or put under too strict and too obvious a penalty of not being in search results, people who are subscribed not being notified, and people being unsubscribed from the channel and things like that, if they did that egregiously, it would become too noticeable. It would give the game away. And it would certainly do so if they did so to excess, Now, don't get me wrong, people did notice it anyway, and it was spoken about on various channels like China Uncensored or America Uncovered, both by Chris Chappell. And he himself came up with a brilliant way of circumventing this by creating another channel, Gamers Unbeaten, where he could talk about philosophical issues whilst gaming. I never had an opportunity to come up with my own ingenious way around it. I simply gamed the system of the word patterning because I can't really focus on video making right now. I have too much else going on in my life. But while a human and an AI might have the same overall goal of downplaying conservative content while upgrading more liberal voices that are more amenable to their desired outcomes, the way the algorithm worked, it really didn't have a way of understanding any sort of perspective on the content. My channel, for example, is not an explicitly political channel. I am talking about political issues now because it's an election year in the United States, and there was an assassination attempt on one of the candidates running for office who also served as president already in the past. But I'm not usually the sort to get too bogged down into politics, and I don't like telling people who to vote for, but at the same time, this is newsworthy, and there are certain issues involved with society. However, I did do a lot of Christian content, not because my channel is Christian, but because I am, and it's a topic I'm interested in. But like I said, this is more a general focus channel where whatever I feel like talking about, I will. And I did a lot of videos on atheists because whenever I tried watching Christian content on YouTube, I would see the comment section being flooded with atheists who found out about the video I was watching from another atheist who did a video attacking the video I was watching and came to repeat the same talking points using the same language, obviously not having watched the actual video, but simply repeating what someone like the Liar of Zod or Pastor Plink or Hamet Mehta, the self-proclaimed friendly atheist, said, or people like them. And it gets annoying because the atheist community really won't leave Christians alone. Basically, all they ever do is talk about how awful and irrational and immoral Christianity is as a religion and how terrible Christians are as people. That's all they talk about. You go to an atheist channel and that's what they discuss. And I'm not saying every single atheist that's alive is like that, but I am saying that if they have to go out of the way and say, I'm an atheist, and they run an atheist channel, and they put atheist symbols like the Scarlet A, once a sign of shame, now a sign of pride, taken from Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, and the little atom that forms an A, showing atheism linked to science, and talking about critical thinking and scientific skepticism, then you know that they're basically just a hate group designed to hate Christianity while pushing a failed philosophical system of secular humanism. One can, of course, be an atheist and not be like that, and many atheists who were like that have moved on, like Steve Shives. Whatever else you think of him, he is no longer a bigoted, anti-Christian atheist YouTube channel. But the real reason I focus on atheists, as I said, is because they won't leave Christians alone, and they're actually doing the opposite of what they claim to be doing. They're not teaching scientific skepticism, they're not teaching critical thinking, they're not teaching reason, they're not teaching anything about science. All they ever do is talk about how irrational and immoral Christianity is and how awful Christians are as people. And quite often they get the theology that Christians believe wrong, but you can't really point that out to them because then they'll tell you that there are 64,000 denominations that all disagree on everything and they don't all agree with what your denomination teaches and what your pastor said. And really, most of the things they complain about, while in some way related to what some Christian group at least believes, is always a distortion, and they will also twist the words of Christians. I've seen them twist the words of Mike Winger, for instance, and I've seen them twist the words of Greg Koukl. Took me a minute to think of his name. I don't really watch those channels too much, so... And I've seen them twist the words of others, like Friar Joseph on the Thomistic Institute. And it's obvious they're not trying to understand what they're actually saying, and to be honest with it, they're simply trying to find fault and to vilify and to demonize them. And ultimately, the way the atheist movement works is to claim they are teaching you reason and critical thinking and scientific skepticism, when all they're doing is teaching you habits of mind that are designed to prevent you from ever listening to what a Christian has to say, or considering it might be true, or becoming a Christian. It's basically there to protect your rejection of Christianity. And these habits of mind have a tendency of going beyond just their original object of rejecting Christianity and becoming how people think about other things habitually. Which means that they have a very anti-intellectual way of approaching things. Like I was watching a Liar of Zod video a while back, where he talked about how the case for a historical Christ is not very strong, but one of his lines of argument was effectively to simply say, miracles can't happen, which he didn't really give a reason for. He just said things like, unless you believe in miracles, which is silly. Sorry, Christians! And he's not really sorry, Christians. He's rubbing in your face that you're stupid for believing in miracles, since miracles obviously don't happen. Which is irritating for an atheist to say, because they also insist they don't believe God doesn't exist. They merely lack belief in a God, and yet he's making a declaration that miracles can't happen, because he is claiming God does not exist. And of course the usual rubbish about how the New Testament, or as they put it, the Bible, because they think the Bible is all one book, is not reliable. But then he makes these bizarre arguments where he says maybe a lot, and he presents hypothetical situations. And he acts as if simply presenting these alternate explanations qualifies as a valid reason to see New Testament accounts as unreliable and not historical. Like saying, maybe Jesus was actually based on several people. Maybe the Sanhedrin actually ordered a guy to be stabbed in a back alley, and the people who wrote the Gospels decided that Jesus would be crucified because that would make his death prolonged and allow people to interact with him. And these are supposed to be his logical, rational arguments, where he employs critical thinking to show the case for a historical Jesus is weak. The hypothetical assumption that Jesus was actually a composite of several people who existed, and one of them was ordered by the Sanhedrin to be stabbed in a back alley, and they simply chose crucifixion to allow his death to be prolonged and allow an interaction while he was dying. That's not really evidence. That's just him speculating and coming up with an alternate history where Jesus didn't exist, the story of Jesus was a pastiche of others, and while the death of Jesus is based on someone dying, it was based on some guy getting stabbed in the back alley on the orders of the Sanhedrin. He had no basis for thinking that was true. He only proposed it because these what-if scenarios allow him to reject the historical existence of Jesus. He's obviously starting as his conclusion that Jesus didn't exist, and then using these alternate explanations as an excuse for rejecting Jesus, rather than looking at the evidence and rejecting a historical Jesus based on the evidence. Because his speculation that maybe Jesus is based on several people, maybe one of them died in a back alley because the Sanhedrin ordered him to be stabbed, none of that is supported by evidence. It's just a maybe, maybe, maybe. And the truth is, the Liar of Zod scenario made no sense. Why would the Sanhedrin hire an assassin to stab someone in a back alley? The Sanhedrin was a court system. And while atheists who hate Christianity, like the Liar of Zod, may counter by saying it wasn't a real court system, it was a religious court, they have to understand that the ancient world didn't work like the modern world, where there was a clear distinction between religious and secular life, and where the Roman Empire was a secular government that separated religion and state. The idea that the Sanhedrin was a religious court run by religious leaders, and thus not a real court, is one that's not really true about the ancient world, where even the concept of religion that people like the Liar of Zod are using didn't really exist, because their concept of religion they're using was developed in the 1500s. Of course, telling these modern atheists that does no good, because they think you're saying belief in gods didn't exist until the 1500s. If you tell them our concept of religion didn't exist until the 1500s, and the way we conceptualize and understand religion didn't exist until the 1500s, they hear you saying, people didn't believe gods existed until the 1500s, and obviously you're stupid, because look at the ancient world. It had temples, and they worshipped gods. Clearly they had religion, because they had temples and worshipped gods. What they don't seem to understand is that the very clear distinction between religion, philosophy, science, and government that we take for granted in the modern world is a product of modernity. It is a product of how thought developed specifically in Western Europe during the rise of the nation-state and at the time of the Protestant Reformation. Religion is not simply believing a God exists. That is theism. And religion isn't simply believing a God exists and worshipping that God. The way we understand religion is as a personally held belief system that is shared by a community of like-minded individuals, where we go to a building or read the same books and all share the same outlook that vaguely has something to do with spirituality or ultimate reality, but is ultimately held at a personal, individual level. And that understanding of religion simply did not exist prior to the 1500s. It was largely the product of men like John Locke. And I'm not saying Locke created the whole concept lock, stock, and barrel, pun intended. But it was still not a concept that you can actually just assume existed in the ancient world. The ancient world did not understand believing a God existed makes you religious, being an atheist means you're not, just as the ancient world didn't understand atheism as a lack of belief in a God. To be fair, neither did anyone in the 1500s or even the 1800s. The idea that atheism is a lack of belief in a God started with Anthony Flew in the 1970s and the presumption of atheism. Although modern atheists like to claim it's actually an older definition and point to things like Bertrand Russell and his teapots, claiming that that was all about the burden of proof being on the one claiming the teapots exist as an analogy for God, and proving that Bertrand Russell thought of his atheism as a lack of belief in a God and how he had no burden of proof. But if you actually read about Bertrand Russell's teapots from Bertrand Russell, his actual point was belief that teapots existed was ridiculous on its face, and no one would take it seriously. And belief in God is the same. It's obviously not true, and it's obviously ridiculous, but because it's a really old idea that comes from a really old book, and our society has always believed in it, and it's traditional to believe in it, then what is common sense and rational is seen as irrational and bizarre, atheism being the natural conclusion. He wasn't arguing atheism was a lack of belief in a God with no burden of proof, with the burden of proof being on those who claim a God exists. He was arguing that God obviously does not exist. And the only reason belief in God is not only respected but seen as the norm, and atheists are seen as outcasts in terms of societal conditions, is because of social tradition. He was not defining atheism as a lack of belief in a God. And the same thing applies to other quotes they like putting out, such as quotes by Charles Bradlaugh or Anne Besant or sometimes Joseph McCabe or others like them. None of them actually understood atheism as a lack of belief in a God. Robert Ingersoll is another good example, because he wrote The God Factory, where he outright states all gods are invention of the human imagination, and we're supposed to think that Robert Ingersoll understood atheism as a lack of belief in a god, not a belief that there was no god, because of some out-of-context quote that doesn't actually say that, but can kind of sort of be interpreted that way if you start with the conclusion that he understood atheism as a lack of belief in a god. And that's sort of the issue that I have with the modern atheist movement. It is an anti-intellectual movement posing as an intellectual movement that tells you it will teach you critical thinking skills and scientific skepticism, but really teaches you to start with your conclusion, but deny you've made a conclusion, and then reject anything that contradicts that conclusion. And it's a habit of mind that goes beyond whether or not a god exists or even religious issues, and it ultimately poisons the mind of the atheist who engages in that sort of thing. And there have been atheists, to be fair, who have agreed with me on this issue and rejected the new atheism or modern atheist movement for exactly that same reason, such as Noam Chomsky, who the divine prophet Sam Harris most wholly was highly critical of, or Stephen Jay Gould, for instance. He didn't believe this either. For that matter, even atheist philosophers who are hostile to traditional religious belief, like Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, rejected the ideas that are being promoted by modern new atheists, even though some of them incorporate some of the things he said into their belief system. They often do so at a superficial level and quite often misunderstand what it is he was saying. Nietzsche is the sort that actually said that atheism does indeed lead to nihilism, but that should be embraced, and you should be willing and strong enough to face the abyss, although most aren't, including most atheists. Friedrich Nietzsche had a very dim view of the utopianism and the utopian atheistic ideas of the socialist of his days, viewing instead a will to power as a much more realistic and healthy goal than an attempt at a perfected collectivist utopia based upon high-sounding ideals that cannot exist in the real world if God does not exist. Because if God does not exist and all that exists is matter, then ultimately we are going to be in constant competition for resources, whether or not we are a communal group, and you cannot overcome the will of an individual through a collectivist ideology, since the individual is an inherent structure, whilst the community is something that has to be constructed. Nevertheless, this video, while I'm talking about the atheist movement and why I talk about it often, is not just about the atheist movement. It is a test video, like I said. So I would like to say other things that I normally can't say, with a few things coming in the next test video. I've already mentioned the name Donald Trump. And now I'm going to say a few things that don't take too seriously. I'm simply saying as a bit of a test. Joe Biden is a joker. Joe Biden is a fascist. Joe Biden is evil. Joe Biden worships Satan. Joe Biden is a monster. Joe Biden eats children. Joe Biden will remove all of our freedoms and create a dictatorship. As I said, this is a test to see about what I'm allowed to say on YouTube, and if this video doesn't go up, or gets a warning and I take it down before you see it, because I will be scheduling it, then I'll know there's still some problems afoot. So what I just said about Joe Biden should be ignored, because let's face it, that was done simply because YouTube in the past was very critical of those sorts of things, although the situation has radically changed, not just because of the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, but also because of the debate performance of Joe Biden, as well as the various interviews and situations he's faced afterward. Many people, even in the Democrat side, are worried about his mental decline and whether or not he is actually up to the task as president, or even if he still could do it now, if he could maintain that for the next 4 years, which are valid concerns because he is in his 80s, and while I'm not saying that everyone in their 80s must be in mental decline and should not lead, there are people who experience mental decline in their 80s, and it's not really their fault. So, there are people worried about Joe Biden as President of the United States, simply because they are worried about his mental condition. We now live in an odd time where if you combine people being worried about Joe Biden's mental state, combined with Donald Trump surviving an assassination attempt and coming off as more heroic to various segments of the American people, with the added effect of that assassination attempt being that the Biden campaign has removed all of its attack ads and a call for a more peaceful society and de-escalation of violent rhetoric. We now have a precarious situation where Donald Trump has an enormous boost, whilst the Biden administration suffers from two great hits on either side of the ship, shall we say, the port and starboard side. And this time I'm not using those as euphemisms for the political sides. On the one side, people worry about his mental decline, and on the other side, he can no longer viciously attack Donald Trump to delegitimize him, because we need to de-escalate the violence in our speech. And that is actually something that I can commend them for. It was something that I didn't necessarily expect. Oh, I expected them to tone down violent rhetorical flares for a bit after the attack, possibly till the election. But I did not expect them to be so open with them doing so. I expected them to just quietly do it. But now they are actively repudiating violent rhetoric and violence-inducing speech, which I must say that I commend. At least they realize that such speech has consequence and actions, and the left has largely been getting away with doing that violent speech based upon the cultural narrative that violence is a trait of the far right, and that the right wing and conservatives are the ones threatening us with violence and possible insurrection and civil war, while the left is tolerant and wants a peaceful society. That very obviously wasn't true, since the left has inspired several riots and violent acts for several years now. But the media refuses to cover it as such, or at least refused to cover it as such in the past. And much like the atheist movement I spoke about earlier, that refuses to be honest about how it has made certain conclusions and has certain beliefs that can and should be legitimately questioned and subject to analyses, but which are hidden behind the word atheism and a definition of atheism as a mere lack of belief in a god to shelter them from criticism, so that the atheist begins with their conclusion and develops mental habits to where they make certain claims, including outlandish ones, but don't have to prove them. The burden of proof is on you to prove they are wrong. And of course, the atheist community also promotes violent rhetoric itself. We now have the left in the politics who did the same thing with the atheist movement, which is not surprising because the atheist movement was always a left-wing political movement. It was part of an effort to delegitimize the religious right in America and to erode confidence in religious beliefs because they associated them with conservative political views. But now we see the left openly backing down from violent rhetoric, not simply backing down by not doing it, but openly repudiating violent speech, albeit the on-both-sides routine, openly calling for more peaceful rhetoric, openly calling for peace, openly saying the attacks on Trump were sick or deranged, or that we have no room for violence in American politics, and how we should respect one another, and I think this is a good turn. A moment of reflection for the left, even if they're not willing to cross that threshold going all the way and admit that they have been engaged in violent rhetoric, and that violent rhetoric has led to real-world violence, culminating, of course, in the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. They are beginning to realize, even if they won't admit it completely, that such rhetoric does have consequences, does lead to violent action, and as a result are taking steps to correct it. Now, whether or not they continue on this trend of attempting to correct it is another matter. I don't know. I don't know if the left will continue on this course or not. But I do know that as of this moment, I can honestly say that the left is doing the right thing. The left is finally beginning to rein in the violent rhetoric that for the past 9 or 10 years it has been engaged in quite constantly. And like I said, I'm not saying that this has never happened on the right. But the mythology that the right is inherently violent or inherently more inclined to violence than the left is not historical at all. The historical reality is the left tended to be more prone to violence and revolution. The left was always on the side of revolution. And while there have been violent right-wing movements, I'm not saying there haven't been, in American politics, the right has tended to be far less violent than the left has for the last decade or so. That's not to say that it can't be violent. I'm not trying to argue that people who hold left-wing political views must inherently be violent. Just that those on the right need not be either. And that violence, like racism, is not something that is actually identified with a single side. And that is another myth that likes to be promoted, that racism is an inherent right-wing concept, and that people who are racist are right-wing and that the left rejects racism. Historically, of course, racism was primarily promoted by the progressivist movement and people that we would today think of as left-wing. But the modern myth is that the right is racist. And of course we bring up a certain man with a funny mustache in Germania, played by Charlie Chaplin in the movie The Dictator, and point to him and say he was far right and he was racist, and that proves it. That the racism is from the far right. The left is not racist, the right is. But in addition to Charlie Chaplin being left-wing and not right-wing, and the myth of him being a far-right dictator is one that you can look at Tick History or other channels and find isn't really true. Charlie Chaplin was a socialist, and he didn't just call his party Socialists for Nationalism just to win votes and would have called it anything. His actual policies were socialist. So the idea that he was far right is silly. And the left has a long historical connection to racism and racial theories. But, with that said, I'm not saying that no one on the right has ever been racist. They have. Racism was ridiculously common in the 19th and early 20th century. Racialist theories that gave scientific legitimacy to racism were ridiculously common and accepted as fact in the late 19th and early 20th century. Eugenics was popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there were people on the right that promoted eugenics, although eugenics mostly found its support on the left. However, the point that I'm making here is not that the myth that we have that the right is racist and racism is an inherently right thing is wrong, because in reality it's the left that's racist, not the right. What I'm trying to argue really is that racism is neither a right-wing concept nor is it a left-wing concept. That people on the left can be racist just as easily as people on the right. Not that they need be racist. And that's because people don't really understand what the concept of left and right-wing actually mean. The left is defined largely as an attempt at developing a more egalitarian society where class distinctions and social hierarchies are abolished in favor of a communalist view and an embrace of a more progressivist, for want of a better term in this concept, because progressive movement in the 19th century is not completely identical with left wing, but that's another matter, concept of social reform, whilst the right is associated with hierarchy, class distinction, and traditional order. There's more to it than what I've just said, but I'm being simplistic. Still, you can be right-wing and not be racist, just as you can be left-wing and be racist. Racism is not really part of the traditional political spectrum. It is a belief that is added onto it, because what defines what is right-wing and what is left-wing is a more broad outline or general blueprint of how society should run, whether it should be hierarchical and traditional and obeying certain strictures and rules and social roles, or whether it should be more generalized and less hierarchical. And to be fair, most left-wing governments in modern Europe or modern America are actually not left-wing in the traditional sense of the term, precisely because they actually reinforce, to a degree, the modern democratic hierarchical system that we all tend to pretend doesn't exist because democracy. But it does. There's oligarchical aspects to it, depending upon what country, being stronger or weaker, and there's, of course, the political class, where people become career politicians or career bureaucrats, and they become the new ruling class, even whilst we tell people that our left-wing ideology makes everyone equal and abolishes class distinctions. Of course, the right wing in America isn't really right wing either, because while they have exactly the same issue, thus making them more right wing than the left wing philosophy would present, has largely embraced the idea that Americans bow to no king and abolish hierarchy and every man is equal. The fact of the matter is, America is at its heart a left-wing government and a left-wing society that shuns hierarchy and that shuns social classes. That's not to say they don't exist. They do. Our current political and social systems depend upon them. But the idea that the right has is not really that there's a group of elites that rule us. It is that all people are equal and that we, the people, rule as a collective, which, while people on the left often demonize right-wingers as wanting oligarchs and lords and even a new king to rule over us, monarchism in America is not really extant, and really the right is telling itself the same thing the left is. The only difference is how they go about it. So the term right-wing and left-wing in America are largely not accurate, because what we really have is an odd fusion of right-wing practical society and government with left-wing idealism running it, and the only difference is what specific social policies either side actually promotes. But because we live in the world we do, I myself will often say right-wing and left-wing, because that's what our society identifies it with, and I want to be understood. As I'm making this video, I just watched the last episode of Star Trek The Next Generation on HNI, by the way. All good things. And tonight, we begin a new Star Trek The Next Generation with a new cycle, because time is cyclical on television shows like HNI and on television channels. Once something ends, we go back to the beginning. So we are now back at the beginning. Encounter at Farpoint. Something that people say is a bad episode and a bad pilot and something that should have killed Star Trek The Next Generation, not helped by the fact that the first season is very weak. That puts me in an odd position, because I actually rather enjoyed Encounter at Farpoint. In fact, I liked Star Trek The Next Generation's first season. Not every single episode, mind you. One of the things that I hate about modern arguments is this idea that you can pick an isolated example and disprove an entire argument. I'm not going to defend The Naked Now, the first regular episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. The second episode after Encounter at Farpoint, unless you count Encounter at Farpoint as 2 episodes with Part 1 and Part 2, in which case it's the third episode. But I generally think of it as the second episode because 2-part episodes are really just 1 episode in 2 parts. I'm not going to defend things like The Naked Now, but I think most of the problem with Star Trek The Next Generation's first season, and the thing most people complain about, in fact, would be things like the characters acting stiff and inhuman and having no real personality that grabs you, and I agree that that's a problem. But one thing I can appreciate about the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation that is minimized in the later seasons, especially starting in Season 3, when the show is thought of as becoming better, is that it actually tried engaging in hard science fiction concepts. It never goes as full-bore hard sci-fi as some other works like Robert Heinlein, for example. But there are many episodes in the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation, like an episode where a shuttle is detected, and it's one of the Enterprise's shuttles, and they bring it in, and an unconscious Captain Picard is in it, even though Picard is on a bridge, and we find out that this is a Picard from the future, from a few hours in the future. Or episodes dealing with things like that. And that episode, in addition to having the harder science fiction concept of time, with the unconscious Picard becoming more and more aware as they grow closer to the events that sent him off, but also dealt with a deeper psychological issue as Captain Picard grapples with the possibility that he was a coward who fled his ship to save himself, leaving the others to die. That is actually deeper, I think, than people give it credit for. It is true that the character writing is problematic because they don't give the people a depth of personality or a range that we would hope for. And because Roddenberry decided that in the future there would be no conflict, this led to a very stiff, formal show where everyone gets along in a very cold, sterile future. Those are real issues. But I think that when they decided to revise the series to make it more appealing to the popular audience, they not only gave more character dynamic and personality to the actual characters they were writing, but they also de-emphasized the harder science fiction elements, which isn't to say that there were no episodes in the later seasons that did those sorts of things. But they did tend to be more simple, and even the ones that dealt with harder science fiction concepts did so in a more simple way, usually, with exceptions, as I said. But that's sort of the thing. Of course, even if I were to just share the popular opinion of Star Trek The Next Generation's first season, let's face reality, the newer Star Treks that are being produced by Bad Robot and by modern CBS, modern Paramount, are atrocities. They're terribly written, with over-emotional characters, poorly motivated, in a world that no longer makes sense. Now, I can't speak too deeply about the newer Star Trek, because even though I'm a lifelong Star Trek fan, I didn't really watch Discovery all the way through. I didn't really watch Strange New Worlds. The one I stuck with the longest was Lower Decks, but I eventually stopped watching it. I didn't really watch Picard. The simple truth is I want to preserve Star Trek in my mind, the way it was when I was growing up. Not because I'm afraid of adding anything new to it, but simply because what is being added to it is bad. It's poorly written, poorly conceived, and does all of the cheap tricks that you would expect, like unexpected killing off of a character. Like when they decided to kill Q, it was dumb, and he just died from plot illness. He just got sick and died. That's stupid. And they did it because it's shocking, because Q is supposed to be immortal, but here he is dying. Oh, shocking. It's stupid. It's not shocking, it's stupid. It made no sense. Now, don't get me wrong, the acting between Patrick Stewart and John Delancey was excellent. I don't agree with Patrick Stewart's bizarre left-wing political views that often hamper the creative process. Patrick Stewart is not a writer, after all, but for whatever reason, they allowed him to have input into how the show developed. But even if I didn't like the actual storyline, watching those two together, especially at the end, was touching and heartwarming and really got at the heart of their relationship. But it doesn't change the fact that the story made no sense and was bad. And I know the story more from the reviews of it than I do from actually watching it, I will admit that. But the storyline didn't make sense from what I saw, and while it is true the negative reviews of it may have distorted and exaggerated some aspects, I'm not really talking about specific criticisms, but the overall idea that Q was dying simply because of plot illness and just died. Of course, people didn't like that and they brought him back, but only sort of, because he told Picard's son, "You're thinking linearly." So I suppose Q really did die, but because he exists in a non-linear state of existence, we're talking to a Q from an earlier point in his life, even though he knows about the later point when he died. He still died, but we can still encounter him. I don't really like that, because even though it allows us to have further adventures with Q, it still means he died, and I don't really like that, though I think they will be largely ignoring it, like they ignore Picard's artificial body. It's one of those things that I think was just poorly thought out. And I think largely because the newer writers do like their mystery box writing, they do like their shock and awe, they do like their heavy-handed allegories for modern messaging. And keep in mind, Star Trek was always a bit liberal anyway, but the difference, besides of course how far left it's gone, is that in the past they had actual writers, and even in the worst series and the worst writing and the worst episodes, there was still skill at writing. For example, one of the worst episodes generally agreed on from the original series was Spock's brain. But Spock's brain, for as preposterous as its premise was still written with all the characters having motives that made sense and were written within established character traits. Whereas now we just have an overly emotional Picard where he wasn't overly emotional before, with no real explanation. Now, granted, it's been 25 years and people do change and Picard is older, but they could write in even just a few lines of dialogue, such as mental decline or something like that, but they didn't. And you see the same thing with Strange New Worlds, where they don't care about continuity, they don't care about how the things are supposed to look. They give them preposterous storylines. They even have a musical episode, and it just doesn't work. And you see the same thing carried out on other properties, such as when Disney acquired Lucasfilm and put out Star Wars, famously, or Indiana Jones, or Willow, and I didn't even understand why they made a Willow series. Willow was a good movie, fine enough, but it had largely been forgotten, and I don't think there were that many people clamoring for more Willow. I don't know why they revived it. But when they did, they decided to dump on the old established characters to promote new, strong women characters. But then they forgot to add things like a cohesive, comprehensive, understandable plot line. And they do the same thing with Star Wars, famously with the Acolytes and the, as they are derisively called now, lesbian communist space witches. They don't really try and understand characters and motivations. In that series, for example, the character of May goes from hating the Jedi and wanting revenge to not wanting revenge and wanting to turn herself into the Jedi to going back to killing the Jedi again. Why? Who knows? Her motivations change with very little warning. Now, they gave some brief explanation for why her motive changed from wanting to kill the Jedi to, and specifically the 4 Jedi who were there on Bryndock when her 2 lesbian mothers and the entire coven of witches died. Because she found out her sister was alive, and that apparently changed things for her. But then she decides to keep killing the Jedi after that when the Sith Master showed up, was revealed to be her sidekick, and he started killing Jedi right and left. Modern Hollywood has a hard time understanding character motivations and writing characters that exist in the worlds they're producing, especially when it's science fiction or fantasy, and especially when those are older properties. You see the same thing with Amazon's Rings of Power, where they don't understand how a medieval feudal society works, they don't understand how Tolkien specifically made his worlds work, they don't understand the elves, they have them dying of elf cancer in the series. They don't understand the point. And the problem is largely, let's put it to you this way. I'm not saying evangelical Christians are bad writers. They're not. There are several good evangelical Christian writers of fiction. And there are evangelical Christians who can take themselves outside of their own experiences and perspectives, even of their religion, of Christianity, of their evangelical Christianity, and understand historical expressions of that faith. There are people who are good, talented, evangelical Christian writers who can understand and put themselves in the past and its perspectives. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument, just to draw an analogy, and I've done this analogy before and I will again in the future, that we have the sort of evangelical Christian who writes the sort of books that one would find in a right-wing Christian bookstore, one that you would find in the sort of evangelical circles where they talk about their personal relationship with Jesus and getting saved and all that. And now let's say that that person is tasked with continuing a medieval epic or a medieval saga, something like the Canterbury Tales or the Arthurian legends by people like Mallory. And they are tasked with continuing those stories and contributing to them, understanding the works like La Morte d'Arthur being canon within the world he's working with. But then he describes episodes with King Arthur, talking about his moment when he got saved, and referring to Jesus as his personal Lord and Savior, and talking about their faith experience. It would be jarring going from medieval Catholics who view relics as holy and having holy properties and praying for the intercession of the saints and viewing Christ as very real and very present in the sacraments, to going to viewing the Lord's Supper as a purely symbolic act, as true salvation not depending upon a church or hierarchy or structure, but it being all about your personal relationship with Jesus Christ, about a moment of salvation. Because medieval Catholics would talk about things like doing penance for sins, whilst evangelicals would have no concept of that. They would talk about praying to saints for the intercession that they could give, whilst an evangelical wouldn't do that. The perception would be very different. Medieval Catholics, for instance, had a hierarchical and feudalist understanding that reflected their own era, whilst evangelical Christians in America tend to make an Americanized version of Christianity, and it simply would not work. They are trying to overlay an evangelical Christian perspective onto an ancient medieval Catholic one. And keep in mind, a lot of the Arthurian legends go back to even before the Great Schism. Not necessarily Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, but certain earlier works like Geoffrey of Monmouth. And that's what you see with the modern woke liberal writers. And I think there's more than one problem. I honestly think they're bad writers. I think they're activists who are simply using storytelling as a form of activism without understanding how to tell a good story. But they are also people who don't understand that you can't take a story with a traditional framework and overlay it with a modernist storyline. For example, you can't take the hero's journey, which the original Star Wars is based on, and overlay it with the modern woke concept of the main character being a victim. And by victim in this context, I don't simply mean they were a victim because something bad happened to them. Anyone can be a victim. A hero in the hero's journey can be a victim, and often they are. But what I mean is the victim character, where victimhood is an inherent trait with who they are. They're inherently broken or damaged or oppressed, and they have to rise up above that, of course, but there's this element of alienation within the victim character. And you can't really do that with the hero's journey. The hero's journey is largely triumphalism, where the hero is the embodiment of an ideal that is unbroken and that cannot be defeated, and that even if the hero is subject to victimization and oppression, never breaks, never bends, always stands, always rises, until at the end he wins his victory against an enemy that largely represents an opposing belief system, proving that his beliefs, his values, and what he stands for and represents is indeed the truth and the superior way. You can't have a victim character doing that because the victim character is not simply a victim of something, but has internalized that victimhood status so much so that they are damaged, they are broken, they are defeated. And you can't have an unbroken, undefeated ideology represented by a defeated character, even if that character rises above their defeat, because we are talking about an inherent nature of their character. Not simply being defeated, but having the personality, having the inherent trait of being defeated. Not simply being defeated as a physical fact, but having a defeated character. The difference between the hero in a hero's journey and the modern woke writer is, even if the hero is defeated, he remains unbroken, his ideals remain unbroken, he remains defiant against that defeat, and he is not defeated as a person. He is only defeated in that he failed to achieve his goals. He is only defeated in that he was stopped somehow or oppressed somehow. But he is not defeated on a personal level, whilst the victim character is, by definition, defeated. They are not simply defeated because the villain defeated them. In fact, the villain might lose, but the victim character would still be defeated because it took so much out of them. They feel crushed, they feel devastated. And that is the difference. The hero's journey can have a victim character in it, but they cannot be the star. The star must be the hero representing the unbroken ideal. And they don't understand that. Just like they don't understand Tolkien's work, which really isn't based on the hero's journey, because contrary to the people who like talking about the monomyth being some ancient storytelling device, it was actually created by Joseph Campbell in the 1950s. But when you look at something like Tolkien and his Lord of the Rings, you don't really have an unbroken, undefeated hero, because Frodo ultimately succumbs to the power of the ring, and it is destroyed inadvertently as Gollum bites Frodo's finger off, takes the ring and places it on his finger, and in celebration dances and falls into the crevasse. The ring is ultimately destroyed by freak accident, not by deliberate action, because the hero did not have the strength to overcome the will of Sauron, a Maiar, an angelic being whose powers far exceed his own, and whose will is far greater than his own, who he simply could not defeat. But Tolkien still wrote from a Catholic perspective, and Middle-earth, while not explicitly Catholic, because it was supposed to be at a time way before Catholicism existed, still operates on the understanding that what the Catholic Church teaches about human nature, for want of a better term, since not every character is human, strictly speaking, what Tolkien believed about the nature of the world and the moral arc of the universe, were all consistently true whether or not Catholicism existed. It's another thing that modern-day atheists don't understand. It's not about picking the right religion and the religion being true simply because I believe in it. It is about the religion accurately reflecting the world around us. And that is the world of Tolkien's Middle-earth, which is fictional, therefore always conforms to its author's creative purposes. But it's a very Catholic world, even if there are no Catholic characters in it, even if it is supposed to be set in a far ancient time before Christianity emerged. It is a very Catholic story. And the modern writers are not very Catholic. I don't think there's a single Catholic on the writing team, and even if they were, they would be a poorly catechized Catholic post-Vatican II, who have a very different modern perspective. And I think it really doesn't matter if the writer is an atheist, or a Jew, or a Muslim, or an evangelical Protestant, or a more traditional mainline Protestant, or a Catholic, because the modern Hollywood writing team behind Lord of the Rings largely shapes their perspective based on the modern American political outlook, rooted ultimately in the modern secular liberal ideology that is largely postmodern in construction and largely influenced by Marxist thinking. It is largely cultural Marxist in its base. It is largely postmodern in its base. And I don't think there's a conscientious effort to set down and synthesize a philosophy where they thought about the ideals of Marx and thought about the ideals of the postmodernists. I just think that these ideas percolated back into society via the early 2000s liberal movement, via the new atheism being a large part of that. But not everyone who embraces it now is necessarily an atheist, and not all atheists are necessarily militant atheists. But the point being made is that whether or not they think of themselves as an atheist, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, doesn't really matter. What matters is this perspective, where they have to promote representation, they have to promote a world of oppressed minorities, they have to present a world of racial segregation, of systemic racism, of intersectionality, and all of these tick boxes have to be present in their storylines. They call it DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, although they are trying to change it now because DEI is being made fun of, as if simply relabeling it changes the core problem. And do keep in mind, as a professional writer myself, I don't actually think DEI writing must by necessity be bad. I really don't. I don't think a woke story is necessarily a badly written story. I do think that a woke story might not be appealing to someone who doesn't share the belief system, but you can write a good story from a technical perspective based on that. And I'm saying that as someone who, if I read a work from a woke writer, a modern postmodernist, I know that sounds oxymoronic. I said modern postmodernist, but modern in this context just means contemporary. I may not like the story written by a woke writer, but it still may be technically well written. I have read Soviet material that explicitly promoted communism, and specifically Marxist-Leninist materials, the ideals that form the basis of Soviet society. And while I deeply opposed the Marxist-Leninist perspective of the writer, and while I deeply disagreed with him about how the world worked, the stories were still well written. For example, there was a Soviet story called Red Star. It's well written. The characters make sense in the world they're occupying and in the way the story is framed by the author. Everything makes sense, but it is nevertheless operating on the assumption that Marxist theories of economy and social order are true. I really don't agree with what was written in Red Star. I don't really agree with the story. In fact, I find it rather disturbing, rather than inspiring. But it was well written. And you could say the same for several other Soviet novels, which I'll go into later. I just wanted to give an example here. I think that the problem with the writing is not that it's woke. The problem with the writing is that it is bad, poorly constructed, and largely lacking in any creativity. In fact, most of the modern Hollywood writers don't create new worlds at all. They simply take an existing older property and try and overlay their modern philosophy and ideology on a pre-existing world where it does not fit. The least damaged by this is Star Trek, because, for one, Star Trek was, as noted, already rather liberal. But Star Trek was never woke. It was never postmodern. It was always modern. And I'm talking in this context as modernism, as in the philosophy. Star Trek embraced progressivism and modernism. Star Trek embraced liberalism, the philosophy of liberalism. Star Trek embraced a progressivist view, whereas the modern Star Trek is postmodern and largely neo-Marxist. It's not really the same, because even though Gene Roddenberry was a socialist and held Marxist views to some extent himself, he was not a full-blown Marxist. He actually rejected Soviet-style communism. And he was himself, at least in the 1960s when he wrote the original Star Trek, a deeply patriotic man. I think that changed in later life, and he was less patriotic by the time of Star Trek: The Next Generation. But I don't think it ever fully went away with him. And if you look at the writing in Star Trek, it remained that way up through Enterprise. Whereas the modern writing is postmodern. It doesn't have the same beliefs. But they are still more closely aligned with each other than something like Tolkien's Middle-earth and Tolkien's Catholicism and Tolkien's traditionalism and Tolkien's, of course, traditional English perspective would be with the modern American postmodernist neo-Marxist perspective that the Rings of Power are doing on Amazon. And if you look at Star Wars, it's very obvious that there was a sort of mysticism which fused Christian mysticism with Eastern mysticism. There were various Buddhist and Taoist elements in the Force and the Jedi, but also some very Christian elements. And that's because it's not trying to tell you what specific religion to follow, but is simply trying to tell you about more broad principles. about connecting to the divine, about connecting to this higher power of life. George Lucas, of course, was a liberal Christian, and still is to my knowledge. But Star Wars was largely based on the work of Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces, The Hero's Journey, the concept of synthesis mythology, and in turn, the works of Campbell were rooted in Jungian psychology, the concepts of the universal unconscious, of instinctual or culturally ingrained symbols that take form in our subconscious or universal subconscious thought and give rise to certain archetypes, which are often culturally linked but represent a more basic, albeit more nebulous, instinctual understanding. Something that is deeply embedded in the human psyche and tradition, something that is foundational, and which goes back to ancient fairy tales and harkens back to how ancient fairy tales and folklore were written. There is something very primal and very traditional about Star Wars when George Lucas owned it, that is simply absent when Disney took it over, because Disney was trying to overlay a modernist perspective that rejects the very concept that we have a universal unconscious, that we have a foundational human psyche, and that instead goes more with Rousseau's tabula rasa, the blank slate model, which introduces the idea that everything in our world is derived ultimately from an economic perspective. Not necessarily economic in the sense of money, but in the sense of material goods, that we are all means in motion, and that we live in a world of constant struggle and power dynamics, where power and who is allowed to wield it ultimately defines how social order is given, which is why the Jedi are heroes in the original films, because they are the underdogs against a powerful empire, but before the empire took over are largely seen as villainous by modern Disney writers, because at that time they were the ones in charge, they were the ones that held power, and in the power dynamic model, those who control the power are going to be corrupt and oppress those who don't, and those who don't will become disenfranchised and will turn to revolutions to overthrow those in power, then of course becoming the ruling power structure and becoming tyrannical themselves. That's because Marxism is based on a Hegelian dialectic, where you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, with communism being understood as the synthesis of history, history being understood as a long series of struggles over resources, with power dynamics of those who control the resources against those who labor to process the resources. And history is a long struggle between those two great forces, with eventually those on the lower class being forced into labor, rising up, overthrowing their masters, then becoming masters and setting themselves up as a new narrow elite, whilst a new lower class develops. And this is a constant struggle that goes back and forth, with the only difference being who wields the power, until a final synthesis can be developed, which abolishes the class system, that abolishes labor and bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It abolishes the distinction between having those in power and those being exploited, by neutralizing it and making everyone the same, abolishing class distinctions and sharing all resources equally. Communism is seen as the ultimate synthesis of all history, within a Hegelian dialectic. And that is how modern Star Wars is being written. Not so much as promoting that final communistic state, but in the sense that whoever is in power is corrupt and is exploiting those who are not in power. Those who are not in power then become rebels and thus heroic, because they are fighting for freedom, but once they have attained that freedom by overthrowing their oppressors, they begin to oppress others in order to maintain their own power and maintain their control over resources. That is how modern Star Wars is being written. It is being written through a Marxist lens. And it is being written through a lens where you have oppressed groups like gay people, trans people, people of color, or at least representatives of those within these worlds, allegorical representations, who of course are being oppressed by the Jedi because the Jedi are in charge and in power, and oppressed by the Republic because the Republic is in power. The concept of democracy being a universal good within Star Wars, or the Jedi being servants of the light side and thus good, is lost, as is the concept of balance as George Lucas understood it. George Lucas understood balance in the Force to be all light and no darkness, because light is good and life, and it is like giving health to a body, whereas the modern writers understand balance as being equal parts light and darkness, which is not really the way it was originally written, and will create inherent philosophical contradictions in the new Star Wars series. And it is largely because of postmodernist, anti-idealist thinking that is being superimposed over a classical Jungian traditional fairy tale structure where it does not belong. Star Trek gets off a little easier than Star Wars because, like I said, it was already liberal, just not as liberal, and it was modern, not postmodern. And it also survives for a second reason, and that reason is that, or at least it doesn't necessarily survive, but it gets off with less damage. Precisely because Star Trek is more episodic in nature. And while they've changed that largely with Discovery having season-long stories, and Picard having season-long stories, they are still isolated within the world of Star Trek, almost like they are simply multi-part episodes, so that the overall whole of Star Trek remains largely disjointed. Star Trek was never like Star Wars. Star Trek is not a story. Star Trek is a sandbox where you can build stories out of certain fixed elements that form a foundation and outline. You must stay within the sandbox and use the things in the sandbox, but you can process any of the toys or the sand however you want. Star Trek never had a plot that encompassed all of Star Trek. Individual Star Trek episodes have plots, of course, but Star Trek as a whole never did, and I think that's what helps it survive easier than something like Star Wars or Indiana Jones even, because there was less of an arc of it, although Indiana Jones was largely episodic as well. Having discussed all of that, I shall discuss one last thing in this rather long video. The excommunication of Carlos Maria Vigano, and how the Catholic Church seems to be going the way that the mainline Protestant churches did, wishing to be more liberal in bringing in more reforms, which of course has spurred an even greater traditionalist backlash, what the media calls a conservative backlash. The media, of course, conflates traditionalist Catholics with conservative Catholics. That's why Michael Voorhees, when he had his scandal about a year ago, was called by the media a traditionalist Catholic, and some of the more liberal outlets that made fun of it said he was the face of traditionism, and even attributed traditional Catholicism as a movement to Michael Voorhees. At the very least, he was a prominent traditionalist Catholic, the face of traditional Catholicism. Michael Voorhees, though, was never a traditional Catholic. He was a conservative Catholic. Traditionalism does not mean the same thing as conservatism. Traditionalism isn't even extreme conservatism, as if all traditional Catholics are conservatives, just not all conservatives are traditionalists. Rather, traditional Catholicism has a different outlook altogether than conservative Catholics. They may be aligned on certain issues, but they are not the same. And while there is some overlap, so that some people might be able to be considered both traditional Catholics and conservative Catholics, by and large, conservative Catholics like Michael Voorhees were not traditionalists, and were often critical of traditionalists. For example, Michael Boris was highly critical of the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX, viewing them largely as schismatic. Nevertheless, it seems that conservative Catholics and traditional Catholics have been pushed closer together by the excommunication of Carlos Maria Vigano, who was excommunicated not for heresy, but for schism. One of the things I've noticed about people commenting on this who are not Catholic, they seem to think Vigano has been declared a heretic. He hasn't. He has been declared schismatic, meaning that he is operating in defiance of the Church's hierarchy and in defiance of the Pope. However, all of his theological beliefs, everything that he actually holds to, is still Catholic doctrine. He cannot rightly be understood as an heretic. He is a schismatic. Nevertheless, people see him as a brave voice for authentic Catholic teaching, who became excommunicated by a liberal, possibly heretical Pope. And if the Pope is indeed an heretic, that means the Pope is no longer the Pope, because a heretic cannot be the Pope. Contrary to how a lot of people think of Catholicism, it doesn't work on the universal blind acceptance of the authority of the Pope, so that the Pope can say or do anything he wants, and can change church teaching however he likes. Should the Pope become a heretic, he simply ceases to be Pope, is not protected by papal infallibility, and has no papal authority. He cannot bind or loose, as the Catholic Church would say the Pope can. He no longer holds the keys of Peter or the throne of St. Peter. And Vigano definitely sees the Pope as out of concord with Catholic teachings and likely as an heretic, as well as those who support him, like Makarek, who has been convicted of certain problems concerning children, shall we say. Really with teenagers, not really children. He's not a PDF file, but he is generally called a PDF file because that's the joke about it. Nevertheless, he has committed improprieties with teenagers, or Bishop Rupnik, who has painted disgusting artwork, but disgusting art is one thing. That is a matter of taste. However, he is also engaged in sexual assault with several women, including nuns, making him a disgusting monster. And yet they are both in good standing within the Catholic Church under Pope Francis, whilst Archbishop Vigano is excommunicated. Many view his excommunication as an honor, though, viewing the authority of the Catholic Church as resting more on Vigano than on Pope Francis, who many are now calling the anti-Pope Francis, someone who is not truly Pope. Meaning that the excommunication of Vigano has created a new breed of sedevacantists, people who believe there is no Pope, and has simply created a greater division within the Catholic Church. Of course, the militant atheists cheer this on, saying it proves that Christianity can't be true. Look at all the divisions in the church. They can't agree on anything. Obviously, God isn't leading them, blah, 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 blah. But really, these sorts of conflicts would be expected within Christianity if it was true. And I, too, must confess to some degree of admiration for Vigano for standing for his principles. And this would be true whether or not you agree that he should have taken it so far as to be excommunicated. Nevertheless, it is obvious that Pope Francis is indeed trying to curtail, if not completely abolish, the traditional Latin Mass, which I will tell viewers who don't know this, is not just the same Mass we have now, only in Latin. The difference isn't just Latin. The difference between the Novus Ordo Massae and the traditional Latin Mass is not simply that the traditional Latin Mass is said in Latin, whilst the Novus Ordo is said in the vernacular, for example, in English. There are key differences. For example, in the traditional Latin Mass, the priest faces away from the people and toward the altar, whilst in the Novus Ordo Massae, he faces toward the people and away from the altar. This may seem like a minor distinction if you don't understand the theology behind it, but the reason the bishop or the priest faces away from the people in the traditional Latin Mass is because he is a shepherd leading you to God, God being on the altar, because in the Catholic Church the sacraments represent the very body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Here is a man leading the people to Christ, a man leading the people to God. His back is to you precisely because he is leading you and you are supposed to be following him. Whilst in the Novus Ordo Massae, he is facing the people. And he is facing the people as their representative in Christ, someone who represents them within the Christian faith, meaning he is facing the people to whom he leads and represents, as if he is accountable to them. And this was a very deliberate change within Vatican II. They took advice to restructure the Mass after Protestant services, where the minister is a minister to the people, rather than the sacramental view that had traditionally been the Catholic position. And there are other differences as well. These differences largely reflect theological understandings. Now, I'm not arguing in this video, because I don't have time, it's already a rather long video, that the Novus Ordo Massae teaches a totally different theology. It doesn't necessarily do so. Just because it's presenting the priest as the people's representative with Christ, and thus answerable to them, as opposed to leading them to Christ with his back turned, doesn't mean there's a fundamental different understanding of the sacraments or the role of the priest. It could be understood as simply a different interpretation of those teachings being reflected, a different perspective on it. And those who defend the Novus Ordo Massae do argue that. They argue that it's more a different perspective, a different focus, a different emphasis, and not a truly different teachings, and not a rupture with the teachings of the Church. But it still is different. The Novus Ordo Massae is not simply the traditional Latin Mass said in the vernacular. There are key differences, and those differences would be important to a traditionalist. And now, we do see Pope Francis, someone who is a reformer, who is thinking about bringing non-ordained deaconesses, women as deacons, into the Church, who is allowing for gay blessings to be happen with gay couples, whether you agree with that or not. It has caused controversy within the Catholic Church, so much so that the divisions have become palpable, and Archbishop Vigano's excommunication has not silenced him, but has caused many to rally around him as a representative of the true faith. This rupture in the Church, while largely overshadowed by the assassination attempt of Donald Trump, attempted assassination attempt. I'm sorry. The reason I said that is because I actually read a news article that said attempted assassination attempt, as if you can have a successful assassination attempt that is not an attempt. The point is it was weirdly worded. Anyway, the point being made here is that Archbishop Carlos Maria Vigano is now a rallying point for people who are both on the traditional side of Catholicism and conservatism, bringing them closer together and rallying to him as a representative of true Catholic faith, as opposed to Pope Francis and the cardinals in the Vatican, who are seen as reformists and thus as trying to change the faith, and to make it more like the Anglicans or more like the mainline Protestants. And this controversy is one that we can see will not go away easily, I'm afraid. But it just shows that people are committed to the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church. Be they conservatives or traditionalists, They don't want the Catholic Church changed in what it teaches, and they don't want the Catholic Church to embrace the ways of the world, which are transient. And one can understand that. One can understand not wanting these reforms, and they certainly haven't helped churches. The churches that seem to retain members or even grow are not the ones that liberalize. They're the ones that are conservative and the ones that tend to embrace more conservative or traditional beliefs. This is quite contrary, of course, to the secularization thesis and contrary to the belief that traditional beliefs drive people away, whilst being more open and reform-minded brings people in. But it is nevertheless the truth. And I think we'll find that we are going to go into a more conservative era, because people who are pushing the more liberal side of things, the woke side as we call it now, have gone too far, too fast, and have created such a momentum toward their side that they are going to force the pendulum to swing the other way, and swing hard. We already know that more and more people are interested in the traditional Latin Mass, more and more people are interested in traditional Catholicism, more and more people are interested in the traditional teachings of the Church. And there are more children involved in the traditional Latin Mass than there are in the Novus Ordo proportionally. More and more people are gravitating, even if they remain within the Novus Ordo, to a more respectful service and more traditional teachings. A service more in line with liturgical traditions that we would find in traditionalist circles and in the traditional Latin Mass, even if they're following the rubrics of the Novus Ordo Massae. And the excommunication of Archbishop Vigano has only hastened this. Pope Francis very clearly wishes to limit or to abolish the traditional Latin Mass, as well as to silence, isolate, or force out of the Catholic Church those who are more conservative or those who are more traditional, so that he can more easily bring in these reforms. But he is stifled in doing so, because even though it was believed that these liberalizing reforms would bring more and more people into the world as it embraces worldly wisdom and worldly ideals of today, people would see the Church doing that and would be more willing to join, whilst the conservatives would have their hairs turned grey and their skin wrinkled and simply die out of old age. What we see is a younger, more vibrant traditional movement and an aging Novus Ordo, an aging reform movement. And I think that reflects not only within the Catholic Church, but within society at large, as more and more people are becoming interested in Christianity, not simply as a religion, but trying to understand its meaning in a deeper way. That's why people listen to Jordan Peterson and his psychological explanations of what these stories mean, and why people are becoming more and more interested in such matters. And I do think that's a healthy thing, because the complete rejection of religious beliefs and traditions of the past ignores that they have to have some truth to them, or else they would not have endured. And I'm not saying that simply of Christianity, I'm saying that of all the religious traditions, including Islam, including Judaism, or for that matter, including Hinduism, or Shinto, or Taoism, or any other of the world's great religious traditions. They have to, in some way, reflect the world in which we live, both the real physical world we live in and the psychological world that we occupy, or else they would not have been able to endure so long, because ultimately religion isn't reducible to believing stories in a holy book really happened historically. There's moral and ethical teachings, as well as value and meaning and purpose found in them, that the atheist movement, the new atheism especially in the past, simply ignored and diminished, and that it gave you nothing to replace it with, because their philosophical system is not really well developed, and what parts are developed are contrary to the psychological nature of humanity, causing greater conflicts, not less conflict. And I intend to do a video on that in the future. But for now, I'm simply trying to talk about these topics to see if this video goes through. But I don't like doing a waste video where I just name certain things, although I did do that in part here earlier when I made a list of Joe Biden doing all sorts of awful things. But for now, even though I don't want to just run a video spouting gibberish that, while it's constructed in the sense that I'm trying to come up with things that would be offensive to our hosts to see if it goes through, I still want to give the people who listen to it, if indeed anyone does, something more to hold on to. Though I am glad now that I am able to speak like a normal person, presuming, of course, that this video goes through. Because I don't really like the affectation when it is not necessary, when I'm not telling a story or doing some sort of thing, or doing a Halloween video, for instance. I much prefer talking this way. I don't really have much else to say, though, and this video is rather long, so I shall take my leave of you. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.